Hello, I'm Christine Whitehead from London School of Economics. I'm going to talk about regulatory change in private rented sectors across Europe. So starting from England, England, as you probably all know, has one of the least regulated private sectors in Europe. Around 1 in 5 of all dwellings are now in the private rented sector, slightly more households. The usual tenure form is simply a 6 months or 1 year contract, at the end of which the landlord may simply not renew it, which is under Section 21 of the Housing Act. The government is intending to get rid of Section 21, but given the way things are going with this government, it's unlikely to be this year. The size of the sector has doubled since the turn of the century. So as I said, it's now over 20% of households, significantly more than in the social rented sector. The proportion is beginning to stabilize and fall slightly, but it's also important to realize that 20%, 1 in 5 of private tenants received housing benefit more during COVID. And so it's really deals with a large number of poorer households. If you look at London, which is much more where it's all concentrated, 30% of London households are private tenants. And when you take that together with the social rented sector, renting is the majority tenure in London. Rents are very much higher in London than the rest of the country. Median rents in London more than double the rents in the rest of the country. And very large proportions of Londoners paying more than 40% of their income in rent. About 1/3 of private tenants in London receive housing benefit. That's 50% more than across the rest of the country. And of course, the proportions have increased during COVID. Internationally, just looking at Europe, every European country has its own system, and own sets of rules with different mixes of rights and constraints. We stand out as being no direct rent controls and short-term tenancies. The majority of European countries, however, have unlimited security of tenure and versions of what is called third-generation rent control. In other words, that rents can't be increased except in relationship to an index or particular changes such as improvement. Until recently, most countries have reduced regulation over the last 40 years, but in the last 10 years, there's a shift back towards additional regulation as private renting has become more important, incomes have become more uneven, and it's difficult. But systems that have been stable, such as Germany, have also got larger private rented sectors. The same, to some extent, is true of the Netherlands. But they also have constraints on entry into other tenures, and some have variations on the system. So that in Denmark, for instance, properties built after 1991 are not controlled. In the Netherlands, if the rent is above 700 euros per month, you can charge a market rent. This diagram simply shows you what happened in the 80s to the 2000s, that a large number of countries, well, a significant proportion of countries, they had really very significant reductions in regulation. Relatively small numbers of countries, Ireland, France, Switzerland, had any significant increase, and in some cases that was quite limited. I think we've already said that the size of the private rented sector is growing right across the board, the USA, Australia, New Zealand, in cities mainly in Europe, Netherlands, and maybe Spain and Ireland, though there are growths in rural areas as well. Importantly, there's growing interest by institutional investors in purpose-built rental accommodation. We haven't had any of that for 50 years, but now we've got a really significant part of the market being built for institutional investors to let to private tenants. But of course, small landlords still dominate. Institutional landlords state they're happy with longer-term security of tenure and within tenancy indexation, as long as there is proper enforcement rules and accepted exceptions, as there are, for instance, in Scotland. But there's also, in that context, a real worry that rules may change. And if that uncertainty grows, then they will be less happy. But there's been this really quite widespread movement away from towards away from deregulation and towards significant increases in regulation. For countries we might look at are Germany, France, Spain, and Ireland. But there's also changes in taxation. So, for instance, in England, individual landlords are now being taxed very differently from those of company landlords, and that makes them at a disadvantage. So, taking four very quick examples, Germany has had third-generation rent control for decades. So, market rents to begin with, or comparative rents to begin with, and then internal rent indexation. But since 2013, Germany has had tight housing market cities, has had limits on rents, with initial rents limited to 10% above the local comparator, and the allowable rent increase reduced from 20% to 15%. It is now in 300 or more cities and municipalities, so it's spread further than where the tight markets are. They don't appear to have limited increases very much. In France, started in Paris, but we have 28 agglomerations with tight housing markets, which have been identified as being able to apply for a pilot rent control scheme where the local authority can determine the reference rents at which it will operate. So far, it's, I think, only 4 cities, but it's probably growing quite rapidly. Ireland, as I said, was very highly deregulated, then moved to a general approach in which rents would be in line with local market rents for similar properties and a regulatory body to enforce. And then in 2016, rent pressure zones were introduced, currently in 21 local electoral areas, but that covers about 80% of the private rented sector. And this was meant to be for 3 years with maximum rent increase of 4% per annum. In fact, they get larger increases than that, but the system is continuing so that the regulatory framework is becoming much more clear-cut. In Spain, Catalonia and Barcelona in particular introduced rent caps in 2020, and the national government has now accepted a housing bill which involves capping rents for larger landlords in stress areas, and that is now with the courts. Also, some incentive for small landlords to reduce rents and for owner-occupiers to let. So far, in terms of its impact, there's very little evidence that it's changed investors' preparedness to invest. That's partly because investment opportunities have been less, and property is seen as really being a good thing, and preparedness to invest in that property in largish numbers so that you can get some sorts of economies of scale is fairly significant. But it also may be because the extreme constraints, when in Berlin produced a real first generation rent control was kicked out by the courts, and additional controls in Paris were also kicked out by the courts. But it's also the case that it's not so obvious that any of this is having very much effect on what rents are charged, partly because tenants have not appealed against the rents, and partly because the data quality and the regulatory enforcement processes are not yet particularly good. So finally, what everybody wants is a certain environment in which both landlords and tenants are benefiting, which implies good enforcement, but good rules as well. The objective is not to cut off the supply of good tenancies, but rogue and criminal landlords should be dealt with separately because they are a quite different issue. But what we want is a basic framework which is for the good landlord and the good tenant. The economic environment is also very important. So the reason I think why it's lasted in Germany in the way that it did is that for many, many years, low inflation, falling house prices meant that there wasn't much tension in the housing markets. But rapidly rising rents in the last few years, especially in Berlin, have brought this pressure for strong controls really up front. And rent increases in Berlin are more rapid than in London, but they start from such a low base that it doesn't matter from a Londoner's point of view, but it matters a hell of a lot from a Berliner's point of view. So there are real issues about what the public want, and of course the current public, the people who vote in London or in Berlin, live there, are worried by the situation and want there to be controls. Economists and people who are not affected are less likely to be very strongly for controls. But Londoners, 65% would have voted for rent control in the last mayoral election. But it's also the case that many of the rent control systems have got lots of exceptions, such as energy efficiency costs, improvement costs, which will enable rents to rise. And sometimes initial rents can be much above comparator rents. It's fair to say that many landlords, whether they're individual or institutional, are happy with long-term tenure security and index-linked rises within tenancies, with willing tenants. So I think that this is the way that most of us see the system going in the near future, but there will be pressures for stronger controls. Whether they will actually be operational is not clear. Uncertainty, unforeseen, unintended consequences are always possible. Thank you.